Hello everyone and welcome to this evening's Postgrad USA webinar. We are so excited all of you are able to join us tonight. My name is Holly Haig and I am one of our Education USA advisors here at the US-UK Fulbright Commission. I'm joined by my colleague Sarah, who's going to help me present to you all about the three main pillars of postgraduate study in the US, including where to start with choosing a university, moving on to kind of putting together your application materials, as well as finding funding. Before we dive right into the sort of, the content for tonight, I quickly want to run through a couple of housekeeping pieces, just so that everyone knows what's going to happen. We will obviously run through all of that information that I've just talked about and then finish up with a Q&A section. Hopefully Sarah and I will be able to cover through many of your questions in the next hour or so, but if you do have questions, please feel free to jot those down as we go and pop those in the Q&A box at the end where we'll best be able to see them and help you out with those. There'll also be a recording of this session shared with you over the coming days, so please don't feel like you have to frantically write down every single thing that Sarah and I say, as you will be able to refer to this at your leisure in your own time as well. Great. So just to kick us off, I'm going to quickly talk about Education USA, what it is that we do and who we are. So many of you may be aware of the Fulbright Commission. The Fulbright Commission was founded just over 70 years ago in the aftermath of World War II. It's founded by a US senator called Senator Fulbright, and he believed that the best way to avoid a Third World War was to promote peace and intercultural understanding through education. And so that is sort of the main mission and aim of our organization as a whole. And so there are a couple of ways in which we do that. The sort of area of the organization that Sarah and I represent is through our Education USA advisory services. And so we are the only official source of US study information here in the UK, and we offer free, up-to-date and non-biased advice and information to students here in the UK to help them apply to universities in the US, and that's both at the undergraduate and postgraduate level, whether that's master's or PhD. We also form part of a global network of advisors. So there are around 600 advisors in 400 centres all around the world. So if it is your dream to study in the US, we are here to help. I also want to flag as well that there is another area of our organisation that many of you might be familiar with, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later on in the presentation when we get into funding. But we do have here at Fulbright what are called the Fulbright Postgraduate Awards, which are pockets of funding for postgraduate students, which many of you may be familiar with. Great. Okay, so to start us off then, why might British students choose to study in the US, and why do thousands of them decide to do this every single year? I'm sure all of you have your own specific reasons why you're here tonight and here to learn more about this process. But up on screen, I've just got 6 of the main reasons why we see British students choosing to go over to the US to pursue postgraduate study. First on the list is a real breadth of choices available and a real variety from institution to institution in the US. Here in the UK, we have about 120 universities offering postgraduate programs. In the US, however, there are over 1,700 institutions offering postgraduate programs. And so just to kind of put that into perspective, there is a huge range of options out there in the US. And as I was saying, there's also this great variety in terms of what each university and indeed what each program looks like. And so you can really tailor your experience to whatever it is that you are after. And Sarah will talk a little bit more about this in the choosing section of this presentation. Next up is that US study is a really excellent way to internationalize your CV. to give you all some context on this, I did my undergraduate degree in the US, and so can speak to some personal experience here that, you know, employers often cite cross-cultural understanding and communication skills as a really attractive quality that they're looking for in their applicants. And it's really helpful to have a diverse array of experiences and to really demonstrate that independence that comes along with being an international student. So that might be another thing to consider. Next on the list is global networking. So when you're a student in the US, you are very likely to be getting to know a huge range of people from all over the globe, and that's not just your faculty, but you'll often have, you know, students from all across the world coming to the US in pursuit of that really high quality education. So you'll have that unparalleled opportunity to connect with faculty and your peers alike. In the US, there's also a lot of opportunity for more hands-on and practical experience. So as we'll get into later in the presentation, you might see that there are more opportunities for kind of hands-on research and getting involved with members of faculty and your department. There's also a lot more emphasis on things like internships, and perhaps through your funding, you may also be working as a graduate assistantship, for example, and get some hands-on teaching experience. So it's just a really great way to, you know, really get that practical experience and build out your CV. Again, expanding your horizons, it's just this idea of, you know, living and studying in another place and pushing yourself out of your comfort zone can really open up a different worldview and may expand other opportunities that become available to you in the future. And last, but certainly not least on this list, is funding opportunities. This may come as a surprise to some of you, but there are a real plethora of funding opportunities available at US institutions, particularly if you do go into this process with, you know, an open mind and a sense of flexibility. But funding opportunities is one of the top reasons why we see UK students heading to the US every single year. There is a lot of funding schemes available, and we'll talk more in depth, as I say, about those later on. I now want to talk briefly about some of the key differences between postgraduate programs here in the UK and those in the US, because this will really help to set you up as you go and do that more in-depth research on US university websites and things like that. A really key difference is the duration of programs, and this applies to both master's and PhD programs in the US. So typically both programs are slightly longer in the US. So here in the UK, where you'd be normally doing a master's that would last 1 year, you're usually looking to be a 2-year program in the US. And similarly, if you are looking to do a PhD, usually your program will last sort of 4 to 6 years, as opposed to anywhere from 3 to 5 here in the UK. If you are interested in doing a PhD, it's important to note that most PhDs in the US involve sort of an integrated master's as part of it, which means that in your first year or two, you'll likely be focusing in on sort of more coursework-based work. And so for those of you who perhaps already have a master's, this is a real time to kind of sharpen any skills and hone in on anything that might be useful later down the line as you progress with your PhD and you hone in on that research. And again, this idea of practical experience we were talking about on the previous slide, to gain more experience of teaching or doing research. And just to note here that that's typically not an optional part of the degree, even if you do already hold a master's. So just something to bear in mind. In the US, there's also no sort of pure research degrees in the way that we have here in the UK. Most programs will include coursework during the postgraduate level, both at master's and PhDs. A note on funding when it comes to the US and the UK. Here in the UK, and we'll talk about this more in depth when we talk about funding, but here in the UK, whereas applying for funding tends to come at a later stage once you have been admitted to your program and you've accepted your place, in the US, it tends to take place right at the beginning of the process when you're choosing where to apply, and it normally takes place simultaneously to the application process. So if funding is a consideration for you, it's very important that you consider it from the beginning of your choosing process so that you don't miss out. And also on the theme of funding, there are no set fees when it comes to US universities. There is not a one size fits all. So each US university is going to vary in what it charges for its cost of attendance. And likewise, there is no set sort of deadline or application deadline or anything like that. There's going to be this huge variance by department and by university. So it's really something to be aware of as you're going into this process. And then finally, just to flag, is that postgrad programs in the US tend to be organized by the department as a whole and not by a particular supervisor. So there's no need to know exactly who your supervisor is going to be right at the beginning of the process. This is especially the case because many programs are sort of a little bit more interdisciplinary in nature. And so they really kind of expect you to figure out your research focus throughout your program. And with this in mind as well, you tend to not need as sort of in-depth of a research proposal as you might do for a UK program. Okay, those are sort of some of the key differences, but I'm sure we'll dive into some more in greater depth as we go through. Okay, so before I hand over to Sarah to talk a little bit more about choosing a university, I want to briefly show you all a suggested timeline that we recommend here at Education USA. So this whole process we recommend should take somewhere between 12 and 18 months. So for all of you, really realistically speaking, the earliest you'd want to be kind of looking to apply and to start your studies is sort of August, September 2022, just so that you've got enough time to really delve into each of these steps. Okay, so first and foremost, and potentially, you know, the most important part of the process is to research universities, which we recommend you really take your time to do. And around 10 to 12 months before you plan to enroll and head to the US, you'll want to finalize a selection of where it is you'll ultimately apply to. Around that same time, you'll want to take any required exams that might be needed as part of the application process. And so you'll want to be double checking those admissions requirements on the university's website as you go through. Going into the sort of summer and autumn time, the year before you plan to enroll, so about 8 to 10 months before, you'll put together an application and submit those according to the university deadlines. This is also a time where you might be submitting applications for funding, whether that's an external funding body or something else, and we'll talk about those later on. Then about 4 to 7 months beforehand, sort of this time of year in the springtime, maybe a little bit earlier, you can expect to hear back admissions decisions from the universities that you've applied to, and you will notify them which one you're going to attend based on the admissions decisions that you've received. Then about 1 to 3 months before you plan to enroll and start your studies, you will apply for your US student visa. You will head to our website to read up on some of our pre-departure resources, and then you will head out to the US to begin your studies. Note that typically this is a slightly earlier starting date than many UK universities, so it will usually be in sort of mid-August, early September time. Great, so that is it from me for now. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Sarah, who's going to talk to you all about choosing a program and putting together your application.
Hi everyone, thanks Holly. So my name is Sarah Ponick, and I'm an Educational USA advisor at the Fulbright Commission. And as you can tell, probably from me just speaking, I am not originally from the UK. I am from Chicago in the US. And I actually completed my undergraduate degree and my postgraduate degree in the US. So very excited to be speaking to you today about US study. So as Holly mentioned earlier, there are over 1,700 institutions offering postgraduate programs. So there are a lot of options, and each institution and department is going to be different. So how do you go about narrowing down where you want to actually apply? Next slide. So this is where I'm going to talk about fit. And here at Education USA and the Fulbright Commission, we talk about this term a lot. What this means is that we want you to find a program that's really going to be the best fit for you and your personal and your academic and perhaps your financial interests. This means that you're not just looking at universities that you've heard of or that have the highest rankings, or maybe that you've heard mentioned in movies like Legally Blonde, but you're really going to consider a lot of different factors. And so the first step in the choosing process is to figure out what factors are important to you. And there are a lot of factors to consider both in and out of the classroom. And so the first thing you'll want to do is start thinking about the factors that are important to you more broadly, and then prioritize these. Next. So these are a few of the factors that you may wish to consider. So one thing that you may wish to consider is the type of institution, whether it's a private institution or a public institution. Another thing that you might consider is the program type, which at the postgrad level can arguably be more important than the institution itself. And with the program type, you might be considering your career goals, your qualifications, any concentrations you might be interested in. Do you want to study in a program with a funded internship opportunities, or a program where you can get grant writing experience? So starting to think about those kinds of things. You're also going to want to consider the academic department. And oftentimes choosing the right department is almost as important as choosing the right university at the postgraduate level. It will influence so much of your experience in the US. And at the postgraduate level, academic departments usually handle admissions and design the course structure for students and monitor a student's progression through the program. And departments can vary drastically in their areas of faculty expertise, their elective courses, their concentrations, whether they're tightly focused or more interdisciplinary, whether they have opportunities for teaching or research, attending conference, internships. So it's really essential to research the department to find the right academic home for you. You'll also want to think about location. The US is a massive country spanning lots of different geographic zones. So for instance, you might be thinking whether you want to be in an urban environment or a rural environment, and that can have a difference in cost as well. It's going to be a lot more expensive in an urban area than a rural area. You might be thinking about the climate. You could be thinking about the access to transportation options. Will you be able to take public transport to get around, or will it be necessary for you to own a car? You'll also maybe think about areas that might be a center of excellence in your field. So for instance, if you're really passionate about political science, you might be looking to go to Washington, DC for your degree. Or if you're really interested in finance, you might be thinking about going to New York City. So that kind of thing in terms of location. Another thing to consider is finance. And Holly's going to talk to you more in depth about funding later in the webinar. But if funding is important to you, then we want you to know now this needs to be a part of your choosing process right from the beginning. Oftentimes funding, especially funding that comes from universities, is awarded and applied for alongside the application process. So you don't want to start thinking about it after you've applied and been accepted, because at that point it might already be too late. And we wouldn't want you to be disappointed later down the line. So if you need funding to pursue postgraduate study in the US, you'll want to be sure to look for those opportunities right from the very start and be including that in your research process. And again, we'll really be encouraging you to think beyond the schools that you've heard of and really take all these different considerations into these different factors into consideration to find your best fit. So with that in mind, and so many different factors to consider, how do you go about narrowing down your options from 1,700 different institutions? So our website actually has a page on choosing a university that includes a list of helpful search engines, such as Peterson's or gradschools.com, and I'll take you through one of those search engines in a little bit. But another thing that you can do is use your personal and professional networks. So for instance, you can speak to faculty and professionals, or professors or colleagues, and see if they have any advice or opinions on schools that could be a good fit for you and places that are known for your field. You might also think about the work of scholars that you've previously read. Is there anyone that you've identified as doing the kind of research that you're interested in and that you would like to do? Where are they teaching? What are their colleagues working on? And that can really help you maybe find some institutions that might be a good place for you to go. And you're going to want to narrow down your choice of universities to about 10 or so institutions. So this is one of those search engines that's linked on our website called Peterson's. And this search engine is particularly helpful to decide and rank what factors are important to you in choosing a university. And the way it works is that by answering a series of questions, the website will create a list of programs you might be interested in and links to their websites. So for this example, we're going to use the tool to look for graduate level schools and programs in a particular field. And in our case, we'll be looking at programs in anthropology. And by using various filters, the website will create a list of programs that you might be interested in, as well as links to their websites. So as you can see here, the search engine pulls up the results, which have highlighted different universities with departments or programs in anthropology. And you'll see that it lists whether the school is public or private, the level of competitiveness and admission, the number of students enrolled, and then there's also a button where you can request more information. And on the left, there's a sidebar that can select a variety of factors like tuition fees, GRE scores, competitiveness to help narrow down the list further. And once you narrowed your choice to about 10 universities of interest, you're going to want to research them further on the university website. And your ultimate goal is going to be to select about 4 to 6 institutions where you're going to actually submit an application. So on the university websites, you'll be able to do things like find more information on the faculty. Some universities will even list the CVs of their faculty, including their research interests and a list of their publications. They can provide contact information if there's a specific professor that you'd like to reach out to. And this can enable you to find out if they're still working on something that interests you. Another good idea is to reach out to current grad students for valuable insight into their experience as a grad student at that institution. You can ask students what kinds of projects they're working on, how close they are with their supervisors, what the campus culture is like. You can also ask more broad questions like what the local area is like. How do you find a good apartment? What's the cost of living? So speaking to a current grad student can be a really good opportunity to get more of a sense of what it's like to be at the university. And usually a department can put you in touch by email with a current student so that you can do that. So that was an overview of some of the main reasons why you might want to study in the US, and also a guide to the choosing process and how to determine your fit at particular universities and programs. And doing that in-depth research in the choosing process is so important, because when you get familiar with the programs that you're looking at, you can then put together the most competitive application possible for them. And the more competitive your application, the better your chances are at securing funding. So the more time that you spend in this research process, the more benefit it will bring you in the application process. So in this section, I'm going to bring you through the main components of completing an application. So what are US universities looking for? So the first thing that they're going to be looking for is your academic achievement, which is going to be measured by things like your undergraduate degree, or if applicable, your postgraduate degree, the degree results, and in some cases, admissions test scores, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Most programs are going to want to see at least a 2.2 on your bachelor's degree, although you can contact individual departments or programs about whether your qualifications are sufficient to be considered for admissions. They won't necessarily have strict entry requirements, but they should be able to give you an approximate idea of whether your academic profile is roughly in line with their usual admitted student. All the other things that are important, the reason for pursuing a postgraduate degree at their institution, how it helps towards your goals, so that, again, is part of your academic fit. They might look at some of your relevant work experience and coursework, and they could look at some of your extracurricular involvement. And this is because US universities want to see a pattern of relevant work and study experience that lay a strong academic and practical foundation for your studies, as well as your ability and interest in being involved both in and outside of the classroom. So in the US, campuses are very lively places, and they want to see the personality of their applicants coming out. A US university may also want to know why you want to study in the US specifically. So the application components. So unfortunately, there's no standard process for applications. It will vary by university, and each university will set its own deadlines and application requirements. So when you're doing that research and narrowing down the institutions where you're going to apply, you're going to want to make sure that you know exactly what's required for the application and when it is required. Luckily, most applications will follow a similar format, and you'll be able to reuse or adapt the materials that you prepare for each. So now I'll briefly go through some of the different components of the application, and then we'll go through a few of these components in a bit more depth. So most applications are going to include an application form, which will include your basic information, contact information, all of that. Some programs are going to require admissions test scores, which we'll touch on more in a little bit. Our transcript is usually going to be required. So this will be a listing of your academic marks, which will likely come from your university. And most programs are going to require a personal statement. We'll discuss this in a little bit more detail in a bit, but this is going to be a place where you can describe your academic interests, your professional and personal goals, and relevant experience. And it's going to be an opportunity to put forth any personal history, context, and to really sell yourself to the program. So this will be a time for you to really shine. And again, we'll talk about this a little bit more detail in a bit. And then a lot of programs will require 2 to 3 letters of recommendation. And the university may provide some loose guidelines for selecting your referees. So for example, they might want 1 letter to come from an academic and 1 to come from a professional referee. You're definitely going to want to choose someone who knows you well, both in and out of the classroom. And I'll talk just a little bit more about this in a little bit. Some programs will require a CV, or it might be called a resume, which will list your professional and extracurricular accomplishments. Depending on the program that you're applying for, they might require an interview or an audition, especially if you're applying for a program in the arts. An audition is probably going to be required. There might be a submission of work that's required. Again, if you're applying to an arts program, maybe they'll require a portfolio. Or if you're applying for a research-focused degree, they might ask you to submit a writing sample, for instance. And then finally, an application fee is going to be expected for each application that you make. And this can usually range from about $50 to $100 per application. So you'll just want to make sure that you're budgeting for that and keeping that in mind when you're deciding how many institutions you're going to apply for, so that you can budget for that accordingly. So to go into a little bit more depth about your academic profile and what that's made up of, it's going to be made up of your grades, so your UK qualifications. It could also include any test scores. So those will be US admission scores that I'll talk a little bit more about in a bit. In terms of research, depending on the program that you're applying for, this might include excerpts from the dissertation that you wrote as part of your undergraduate degree that you submit as a writing sample, for example. It could include some work experience, and this is going to vary depending on what program that you're applying for. So for instance, if you're applying for an MBA, it might be that they're really looking for work experience as part of that application, but for other programs, this might not be a really important component. And then we've got here the X factor. And what we mean by that, not the television program, but what we mean by that is anything that makes you stand out. So for example, if you're an international student, maybe you had a really unique undergraduate program, and you can make a strong case as to why you would bring something unique to their program. And so you'll really want to think if there's anything in your academic profile that really makes you stand out and makes you unique, because that can make you even more competitive for admission and for funding to the programs that you're applying for. All right, so now we'll talk a little bit about admissions tests. And in the US, admissions tests act as a method of evaluation due to a lack of national curriculum, and it helps to kind of level the playing field a little bit. So the first thing that you'll want to do is to confirm that you even need to take a test, because not all programs will require it. So make sure that you're doing that research and only take a test if you need to. And if you do need to take an exam, then make sure that you're taking the right one. And you'll find this information on the website of each university where you plan to apply. And you'll want to make sure that you're paying close attention to the application deadline, and so that you can plan your exam schedule accordingly. And so you might be asking, how important are standardized tests in admissions decisions? Because we know that it's something that people think about. And the answer is, it depends. So some universities, as I've said, might not require them at all. For others, it might be that it factors into their decision, but they're actually more interested in your personal statement and your transcript. It could also be that there's some programs that are going to look at one part of your test, like the verbal reasoning section, more than how they look at the quantitative reasoning section. So it really just depends. If you want to know, you could always reach out to the institution where you're applying and ask how much weight is given to the exam as part of your research process. And as you see here on the screen, we have a lot of different exam names. You see the GRE is one of them, and that is actually the one that is used for most master's programs. So you might see that one come up quite a bit. And it's an exam that measures your aptitude for abstract thinking in the areas of analytical writing, mathematics, and vocabulary. There's a few other exams that you might come across. The GMAT is used for MBA programs and business programs. And then you might see reference to the LSAT, which is used for JD programs, although not for LLM law programs, which just require an undergraduate degree in law. You might see the Ncaa mentioned for an MD program. And something to note about all of these exams is that they're quite different to what you might be used to in the UK. They are multiple choice exams. They have a strict time limit. And so what we would suggest is that you register early for the exams. We typically suggest that you sit the exam by October if possible, which leaves you the option to kind of retake in November or December if necessary. And then we would strongly, strongly recommend that you prepare for the exam in advance. So there are a lot of free prep materials online. You can sit mock exams under time test conditions. If you'd like, you can also buy study guides, or you could even hire a tutor. So there are ways to prepare. And in COVID times, you of course will want to make sure that you're doing your research to see if COVID has affected whether the test is required at the moment. And a lot of the exams are running, and they've made accommodations to kind of make them run. So just kind of make sure that you're keeping up to date with all the information on the appropriate websites. All right, so a little bit more about the personal statements. So one of the most important parts of the application is the personal statements. And this is really going to be a chance to kind of sell yourself to the program that you're applying to. It's not like your UCAS personal statement, but rather an opportunity to showcase what you can bring to the institution. And note that some universities might ask for an essay instead of a statement, or they might ask you to address something specific. So just check the requirements carefully. But in general, a personal statement helps reveal an individual's character, motivation, future goals, and interest in their particular university, program, or field. And since there's usually no set structure for writing a personal statement, you have the opportunity to be creative and make yourself stand out. So some students choose to start with a quote or an anecdote describing how they became interested in their field of study. Others use a central theme to link and describe their experiences and their future plans for their studies and career. So feel free to kind of, really get creative, and also don't be afraid, don't be modest, be strong about how well you've done, and really sell yourself. And something to note here is that it's a personal statement is not an in-depth research proposal. Some universities may ask for separate research statements that outline your research interests and future plans, but it's not the same as a personal statement. So just to note that here. And the last part of the application that I really want to go in a little bit more depth in is the letters of recommendation. So as I mentioned earlier, you'll likely be required to gather 2 to 3 letters of recommendation, and you'll be asking a variety of people who know you well. So as I mentioned earlier, the university might provide some loose guidelines for selecting referees. So for example, one from an academic, one from a professional referee. And so you'll be making sure that you do that. If you have multiple academic referees to choose from, you'll want to choose someone who knows you well, both in and out of the classroom. And you'll want to be making sure that you choose referees that can complement your application and also that can complement the other referees so that you have a good balance of kind of classroom, professional, research, and extracurricular. And one of the things that you may wish to do is actually sit down and meet with your referee or virtually meet with your referee to discuss the recommendation letter. It might be helpful to, if you choose to give them a copy of your application, to talk to them about the reasons why you're doing a postgraduate degree in the US or in your chosen fields, why you've chosen these particular universities to apply to. And very importantly, you'll want to make sure that they're aware of any deadlines and what the paperwork is that they need to complete. You can, if you wish, make suggestions for the contents of the letter. You won't actually see the letter, but you can make suggestions for things to include. And you can kind of direct them to maybe mention your ability to succeed at the postgraduate level, any observations they have about your performance, your ability to positively contribute to the program that you're applying to, any leadership abilities, or to speak to your character, or they can speak to your passion for your subject of choice. But another very important thing is to encourage them to avoid being restrained or too modest. American referees tend to write in a very enthusiastic tone. They use very positive language, descriptive language to discuss the applicant both in and out of the classroom. So bear in mind that what will be written about your American counterparts is going to be, very enthusiastic. And so when you're preparing your UK referees, make sure that you're encouraging them to not be too modest, just like with the personal statement that you're writing, be effusive with that language, be enthusiastic. All right, so now that we've broken down the application process, I'm going to hand back over to Holly, who's going to talk about funding your studies.
Thank you, Sarah. So yes, funding is one of the topics that we most get asked about here at Education USA. And as we've alluded to throughout tonight's webinar, there's this big misconception that US study is always very expensive, and we want to just highlight that that really is a misconception, and that the good news is that a significant amount of funding is available at the postgraduate level, both for master's and PhD programs. But the key here, as Sarah was talking about earlier, is to really be flexible and open-minded about where it is you're applying and the different universities that you're considering. Okay, so where does this money come from? Up on screen, I have got sort of 4 of the main different sources of funding that you're going to find when you're thinking about studying in the US. Before I dive into each of them individually, I want to highlight that US universities themselves and external funding bodies are going to be, your preferred method, because oftentimes these won't need to be paid back. But just to sort of give a bit of a background to these sources of funding, it's important to be aware of the big cultural difference that exists between funding studies here in the UK and funding studies in the US. Whereas here we have a very loans-based system where you'll apply for a student loan and then pay that back once you're employed over a certain salary. In the US, there is a real culture of saving and paying for university in a way that doesn't exist in the same way here. It's seen to be something that's really strived for, and it's something that parents will do for their children from a very early age or even before they're born is saved for their higher education. And so with this in mind, you'll find that there is an expectation for you yourself or perhaps even your family to contribute in some way towards your studies. So that is just something to first and foremost be aware of, that there will be that expectation from US universities to fund your studies. Next up, though, are the US universities themselves. And we would, as I said before, point to this being the best resource for funding your studies if you can access it. And there's two main ways in which US universities can offer funding. The first are what are known as fellowships or scholarships. These are usually used sort of interchangeably, but they might have a slight distinction depending on the department and depending on the university. Both of them are outright grants usually, and fellowships tend to have more of a research focus and be attached to, you know, a student's particular personal research goals, whereas scholarships might have a particular set of criteria that they are meeting, that their applicants are meeting. And, you know, these are going to look very differently according to the department and the university. So for fellowships and scholarships, you'll want to have a look on the university website for what's available. The second type of US university funding is what are called graduate assistantships. And these are offered in return for you providing a service to the department that you are studying under usually. And so this might be in the form of you doing some teaching to an undergraduate class. It might be that you're doing some research alongside a professor or supervising a lab, or you know, even working in an administrative role within the department. And so you, in exchange for your work, will then receive a fee waiver towards your cost of attendance. And in some cases, you may even receive a stipend on top of that to cover things like cost of living. You know, the terms of assistantships, it's really important to note, will vary from university to university. And so, and it will sort of depend whether both of these types of funding are available, or indeed any. So it's really important that if university funding is going to be important to you, that you're looking out for what is available as you go through that research process that Sarah was talking about before. Okay, there are then what is called external funding bodies, and I'll talk you through an example of these later on. But these are, you know, funding, as the name suggests, that is external to the US universities. So they're separate organizations, and these are kind of seen as sort of niche scholarships. So they'll have their own criteria that they're looking for, but the institutions might be, you know, charities, companies, foundations, trusts that have a vested interest in students on particular characteristics to perhaps go and study a particular field, or to go and study in the US from the UK. So if you're interested in external funding bodies, we've got some links on our website that you can definitely check out to help you identify those. But there's going to involve quite a bit of legwork on your end to identify from the sort of hundreds of different organizations out there who are going to be the best fit for you. And then last on the list, we have got loans. Now, we caution that loans be considered only as sort of a last resort once you've already exhausted the other three types of funding on the list. This is because it is a little bit tricky for UK citizens. So if you're going to the US, unfortunately, you're unable to take out a UK student loan here and transfer that with you to fund your studies. And most US lenders will require a US citizen to co-sign the loan. So with this in mind, most UK citizens will take out private loans from a UK bank to fund their studies if that's the route they're going to go down. But we would just caution with that you really need to examine those terms closely, because they'll often have very high interest rates and long payback terms, which might be particularly tricky if you are expected to start contributing back to that loan whilst you're still studying and perhaps aren't earning and can't contribute that way. If, however, you do hold US citizenship or are a US-UK dual citizen, you may be eligible to take out a loan from a US lender directly or apply for US federal loans through what is called FAFSA. So if that applies to you, definitely check that out. And we've got some really useful links on our website to help you with that. I'm now going to talk about funding strategy then. With these different sources in mind, what are some things to think about in terms of lowering that cost of attendance and that funding piece? So up on screen, there are 3 factors that I've listed, and I'll talk through each one of them. Note here that you might not necessarily be able to use all of these 3 strategies in one go. You might have to kind of pick and choose. But it's just helpful to be aware of the different factors at play. First of all, one funding strategy you might use is to look at universities that are located in areas where there is a lower cost of living. And so you might think about a rural area versus an urban area, and the same principles apply with what we're used to seeing here in the UK. If you're going to study somewhere like LSE or UCL and be slap bang in the middle of central London, it's highly likely that your cost of living is going to be a lot higher than, say, someone in Liverpool, which is where I'm from, studying at the University of Liverpool, where the cost of living is going to be a lot lower. You're going to have lower rent, lower expenditure on personal expenses and things like that. So the same applies in the US. If you're going to be only applying to universities in really big cities like New York or Washington, DC or Los Angeles, it's highly likely that you're going to have a much higher cost of living than if you were to study somewhere a bit more rural, like Vermont or Michigan or somewhere like that. So having to think about that might be one strategy to use. Next up is having a look then at universities that have lower costs of attendance or lower tuition rates. So you might decide to look at public universities versus private. So a public university is one that is state funded, and these generally have lower costs of attendance than do private universities. On that though, which leads me on to my next point, is that private universities might have higher availability of funding. They might have more funding opportunities than do state schools or public universities. Funding is going to vary from department to department. So you might pick a department that has lots of funding available. Maybe they have on their website that they offer graduate assistantships to 100% of their cohort versus one where there's only a couple of fellowships available. That might be a better fit for you. Another thing when it comes to university funding is, can you be a bit entrepreneurial about where that funding is coming from? So let's say if your work is a little bit more interdisciplinary in nature, is there an opportunity for you to perhaps write to a department that has a crossover with where you're studying at the moment and ask them if they're able to fund you in any way? For example, if you were doing a program in architecture and you were a student at the architecture department, perhaps you have a particular interest in environmental architecture and how to make buildings more green. Would it be possible for you to reach out to the environmental studies department and see if they have got some funding available to help you towards your cost of attendance? So as I say, those are just 3 funding strategies to consider. It's unlikely that you'll be able to have every single one of these available in one particular university, but it might be that you're able to use 1 or 2 of them at the time to lower that cost of attendance and make things a little bit more affordable. To give you an example of this sort of lower tuition piece in particular, I want to pull up an example. So up on screen, we have got Boston University and the University of Massachusetts, Boston. So as the name suggests, both of these are located in Boston, Massachusetts, really big city. And if we're just going to take an example of the Department of Education and Human Development, at Boston University, this would cost over $72,000 with tuition and other fees taken into account to do a master's in that department at Boston University. Comparing that to a master's at UMass Boston, where tuition and off-campus finances would be less than $25,000. Another thing to emphasize here is that sometimes universities that are located nearby to one another often have links and relationships with each other. And so it might be possible that as a student at UMass, you are able to enroll in courses at Boston University, where you're effectively paying, less than a third of the price to have, the literal same courses as you would be at Boston University. So this example just serves to say, these two universities are located in the same great city, but they have a huge variety in terms of fees and tuition rates. So it's really important to go into this process with that open mind and just be flexible about other options that might be out there that might be a better fit for you, particularly in regard to finances. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit more about finding those funding opportunities and how do you go about identifying them. As we've talked about, the best resource that you can access is university funding itself. So where do you go about looking for those? I would say that there are three main areas of a university website that you want to be looking at, because it's not, as we've discovered at several points tonight, there is not a huge greatest deal of standardization. And so you want to track all three areas that I'm going to list, just to double check you're not missing anything. So you first of all want to look at the department itself, have a look at its pages to see, do they offer assistantships? Do they offer fellowships or scholarships? And what do those look like? How available are they? How competitive are they? You also want to look at the graduate school as a whole. So there might be a page that speaks across all of the different departments. For master's programs at that university, there might be one set policy across all departments rather than determined by each department. And you'll also want to look to see if there are pages specifically about financial aid. So there might be, a financial aid or a funding or student finance area of the website where you can check that out. Okay, so, what do these pages say? Does it look like there is much funding available? One thing that I will say is usually when universities do offer funding, it's something that they're very open about and upfront about on their website and try to make it as clear as possible. On the other hand, if funding is not very abundant at the university, and it's looking really difficult to find, that may be an indicator that there isn't a great deal of funding on offer if you're traipsing through the website and not finding anything. If the information isn't available, definitely double check and reach out to a departmental administrator, I would say, just to inquire and make sure you haven't missed anything. But just to be aware of, it might be an indicator that there's not so much funding available. Another thing that's important to do is to think about where you'll be most competitive for funding, which is what Sarah was saying. So you might want to take into consideration, how does your application stack up against the average admitted applicant at a particular department or university? And many universities will post this on their admissions pages, is what's called a profile of an average admitted applicant. And so you can kind of have a sense of how do you stack up against that average admitted applicant. You also might want to ask directly with the faculty members at the universities you're researching upfront, how competitive is it to get an assistantship? Are they full or partial? And really get a grip of what is on offer here and whether it's sufficient for what your needs are. You also might decide to ask current students, like Sarah was saying, to get that real insider's view as to, what is the work-life balance like for having an assistantship? Is your Was your GRE score factored into whether or not you were awarded funding? And then as well, as you're doing that in-depth research and contacting the department or contacting a current grad student, you'll also want to get a sense of, are there any additional requirements in order to apply for funding, or will I automatically be considered for X fellowship or X scholarship simply by applying to the university? So I'm now going to give you an example of one university's page. So this is the website of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and their political science department. And UNC Chapel Hill, in case you're not familiar with it, is a really top research university in North Carolina. So up on screen, we've highlighted a couple of sort of key nuggets of information that speak to the different funding opportunities that are available in the political science department. And I'll just read those out as we go through. So we first of all got that most students in the Department of Political Science are indeed supported by fellowships and assistantships. So straight away, we've got that indication that both types of funding we were talking about are offered here, which is great. In terms of how you're eligible, it says graduate students in political science are also eligible for a variety of competitive university-wide fellowships and scholarships. So as we were saying, these are university-wide, not just specific to the department. So there's an additional set of scholarships that students might be eligible for. And we also get this idea of funding strategy that we were talking about down here, where it says, Chapel Hill is a highly livable college town with a low cost of living. So straight away, we see that idea of, okay, yes, perhaps UNC Chapel Hill has on the face of it quite a high cost of tuition. It has a real abundance of funding opportunities, of university funding, and it also has a low cost of living in the local area. So we've got two of those three funding strategies that we mentioned before. We've also got, just to give you an idea of the types of things you're looking out for, we've got information about what the assistantships entail. You might be involved in teaching a course, conducting sections, and assisting a faculty member in research and teaching. So really just to give you an example of what it is that you're looking out for when you're seeking out these funding opportunities on the website. Okay. We also talked about external funding bodies briefly earlier on. And one example of external funding bodies is the Fulbright Awards Program, or the Fulbright Postgraduate Scholarships, as some of you may know it as, which are hosted by a team within our organisation. And now the Postgraduate Awards provide the only scholarship available for academic work in any graduate department or program at any accredited US university, and that's for the All Disciplines Awards. So that is one reason why it's very popular amongst British students, is because you can apply for any program, master's or PhD, at any US university. There are also specific awards for certain topics or certain fields. So for example, there is the Lloyd's Bank Award, which is all about risk. So you might initially think being funded by a bank that is economic risk, but that can also be applied to, political risk or health risk, for example. So you can really tailor some of those broader topics to your work. And similarly, there are some awards that are specific to particular universities. So the Brown PhD Award, for example, covers all of the years of a PhD program at Brown University. In terms of applying for the Fulbright Awards for the academic year 2022-2023, those are going to open later on this year. I believe in August, sort of late summertime is when those open, and will close up in November. So if you are interested in learning more about the Fulbright Awards, I'd encourage you to have a look on our website, where there's some really detailed information about eligibility criteria and how to apply. And if you do have additional questions, please feel free to reach out to our programs team whose email address is up on screen at the moment, programs@fulbright.org.uk. All right, so just to recap some of our top funding tips. As we've said several times tonight, start this process early. We can't recommend it enough. Applying for funding often takes place simultaneously to the application process itself, and typically does not come at that later stage once you've already been admitted. So begin the search for funding early. Really encourage you as well to be willing to put in some extra time and effort into seeking out and applying for these funding opportunities. Scholarships are not going to find you. You very much have to look for them. And so you need to investigate the university funding on the pages that we just talked about, and take the time and initiative to search for these often more niche external scholarships. Again, can't emphasize this point enough, is to really just be flexible and open-minded in choosing universities. If it's essential for you to receive funding to complete your postgraduate studies, you've got to choose departments that are there with a lot of funding, or where you're going to be top of the application pool and a really competitive student, thinking about, you know, maybe academic performance in the past, your GRE score, and also, you know, the strength of those essays that Sarah was talking about earlier. Another thing to think about as well, finally, is just to minimize those sort of upfront costs, having to think about the funding strategy we're talking about before, having a look at ways in which you can bring down that cost of attendance through university funding, having a look at costs of living in the local area and things like that. And then last up, we've also got financial assistance in country. As an international student on an F1 student visa, you are eligible to work up to 20 hours a week on campus during term time, and up to 40 hours a week on campus during sort of holidays and breaks and things like that. So this won't be calculated towards your visa, when of course you have to show evidence that you are able to fund your studies in order to get that visa granted. But it might be a helpful thing to have under your belt in terms of helping with some of those costs of living whilst you're in the US. So that's another thing to look out for, is am I able to get a on-campus job while I'm studying? Okay, great. So we've talked a lot tonight, we've given you a lot of information, but after this webinar, what are some of the other ways in which we can help you to make your US study a reality? Sarah and I have mentioned it a lot tonight, but first off is our website. We have, under this Going to the USA tab at the top, a whole guide to postgraduate study, walking through all of the key areas that we've touched on this evening in a lot of depth. And there's lots of really great links and resources that you can peruse, whether that's search engines to help you narrow down your options, whether it's different scholarships. So definitely take a look at our postgraduate guide on our website. You can also find information about the Fulbright Awards there too. You can reach out directly to Sarah and I and our colleague Rowena. We take questions via phone on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and we also take emails all throughout the week. So please do not hesitate to get in touch with us if you'd like to talk more in depth about your circumstances. We're more than happy to help. Again, all information on how to contact us can be found on our website. You are all doing a great job of this already, but we host several events about studying in the US throughout the year, online, and when we don't have a pandemic, in person when we're able to as well. So do keep an eye out on our website for more information about upcoming events that might be of use to you. Great. So we're now going to move into the Q&A section of this webinar, and I'll invite Sarah back up on screen to help me out with that as well. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to drop those in the Q&A box, which is where we'll best see them. And if you do have to step out at this time, thank you so much for joining us. And we will be sending out the recording of the webinar soon, so you can always catch up with the Q&A at a later time that suits you better. All right, Sarah, have we seen any questions coming through?
We do have some questions coming through. So the first question that we've got, Holly, is do you need US work authorization to apply for a graduate assistantship?
Great question. So usually your assistantship will just be on campus, and so it will count as sort of an on-campus role. And because it's factored into your funding package, you won't need specific work authorization, and international students typically are eligible to go ahead and apply for those. If you do have specific questions on that, though, I would definitely recommend reaching out to the international admissions officer, or to the International Student Services, because they will be your visa sponsor while you're on campus, and they have got all the most up-to-date information about their university's policy when it comes to working as an international student on campus.
Thank you. So another question that we've got is, can grad students play college sports if they have remaining years of Ncaa eligibility? And do they have to register with the Ncaa Eligibility Center to demonstrate this?
Yes, that is a great question for the Ncaa. Typically for athletes, it's usually something that goes on predominantly at the undergraduate level, but reach out to Ncaa to see what they can do for you if you do have those remaining years of eligibility left. And indeed, what opportunities are there on the at the departments and at the universities that you're interested in, because I suspect that it will be important to match those two things up in order to pursue that.
All right. A couple of questions about the Fulbright Awards specifically. So I think we'll take a stab. We could take a stab at these, Holly, can't we? But if we can't answer it, we can always defer to our programs team.
Yes. And what I'll do, Sarah, while you're asking those, is I'll put the email address to the programs team in the chat so people can reference it as well.
Okay. So the first question is, does the amount of funding granted depend on the fees of the college you go to? And then, is it possible for Fulbright to only approve funding for one of your university choices? So if I put 4 on my application, is it possible to only approve 1 for funding?
Okay, so the first question has to do with the amount funded. So for the All Disciplines Award, the grant aims to cover the first year of study. And so that's what the All Disciplines Award does. But the different niche awards are going to look differently in the amounts that they fund. In terms of the second question about funding for one or all of your university choices, ultimately you are just one person, so you'll only be going to one university, I should imagine. And so whichever university that you plan to accept an offer of admission at, and should you be successful in applying for a Fulbright award, they would cover that university's cost for you.
Great, thank you. So this next question is, as a second-year student in a 3-year degree ending in 2022, would you suggest applying in 2021 or 2022 after I graduate? So I can get started on this one, and then if you want to add anything, Holly. And I think the answer to this is really that it depends on whether you are hoping to go for your postgraduate degree immediately after you graduate, or if you would like some time afterwards to get some work experience, or travel or whatever you decide to do with your life. And if the answer is that you're hoping to go immediately into postgraduate study after you graduate in 2022, then we would recommend that you start the research process in 2021, and your applications will be happening kind of later on this year. Does that sound right to you, Holly? Is there anything that you'd want to add?
One thing I would add is in the US, I'd say many Americans tend to take a bit of a gap from when they do their undergraduate degree and their postgraduate degree. And so it's not unusual for universities to see on students' applications that they've had some professional experience during that sort of gap between their studies. And so absolutely, as Sarah was saying, it's totally up to you when it is that you study, and you won't be penalized if you go straight into a postgraduate program. But what I will say is that, as Sarah was saying earlier in the presentation, it's important that you have this sort of, US universities are looking for a well-rounded person and someone who has got that kind of experience, and that might be through, student leadership or something like that, rather than a professional experience. But in any case, you want to make sure that that's factored into your application as well as just your academics, if that makes sense.
Yes, I think that sounds good. Thank you, Holly.
Mm-hmm.
And so another question is, are there likely to be a lot of obstacles for someone with a young family wanting to undertake a PhD in the US, such as with visas and insurance?
Great question. It's going to look differently at different universities, what the sort of support structure is for families and whether they're able to give you the sort of correct visa for that. And so my best advice is to have a look on the US Embassy website here in the UK, because they have a lot of information about the different types of visas and limitations of that would come with taking a young family with you to the US. And also having a look, especially as you're doing your research process, about things like, are there particular housing that the university is able to offer that would be appropriate for you and your family upon studying in the US? But absolutely, it is possible to go and study in the US and do a PhD with your family, but it will just, be a case of double checking both with the embassy and with the university as to what that process looks like.
Great. And then a final question at the moment, unless we have some more, a question about entrance essays. So do I need to submit a separate entrance essay for each university, or can the same one be used more than once? And so again, I think I can start on this, and then if you've had anything you'd like to add. So kind of going back to it, a personal statement. So if it's a personal statement that's required, what I would say is that it's probably going to depend on the institutions that you apply to. It's very likely that your personal statement is going to be broadly similar if you're applying to the same kind of program at all of the institutions. And so it could be that it's a very similar essay or statement that you write, but it might be that you want to kind of at least slightly tweak each statement to kind of really cater itself towards that specific program that you're applying to. So because again, going back to that idea of fit, you want to show that you're a really good fit for that institution. And there might be something specific in the research that you've done when researching that institution that you can kind of tie into your personal statement that kind of says to them, oh, wow, this person has really done their research and seems like they would be a good fit for institution. And so, yes, there is, you'll probably be able to use a big chunk of it for each of it, but you'll probably want to do a little bit of kind of catering towards the institution that you're applying to. Is there anything that you'd like to add to that, Holly?
No, that was perfect. And then I can see one last question we've got coming in has to do with, for the Fulbright Awards applications, are there any age restrictions? Can mature students apply? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. There is no age restriction in terms of applying for a Fulbright Award. Anyone from any age group can apply. But for full information on eligibility criteria, I'd encourage you to double check on our website just to get that full listing of what to expect when applying. All right, I think that is the last question that I can see coming through. Thank you all so much for tuning in to join both of us this evening. It's been a pleasure to have you. And if you do have any additional questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to us by email or phone, where Sarah and I will be more than happy to help you. All right, until then, I hope you all have a great evening and take care. Bye.
Bye.